There was a time when you tried harder. You showed up to the gatherings. You pushed through the discomfort of small talk. You stayed longer than your body wanted to, because leaving early felt like something you had to justify. You laughed at things that were not funny to you. You asked questions you already knew the answers to, because silence made other people uncomfortable, and their discomfort somehow became your responsibility. You were quiet then too, but it was a different kind of quiet, a younger quiet, one that still carried the hope that the world might eventually meet you where you were, that the right group would appear, that the right conversation would unfold, that if you just kept showing up, the effort would eventually stop feeling like effort and start feeling like belonging. And then something shifted, not suddenly, not because of a single event, but gradually across years, through the slow accumulation of evidence that the world was not going to change its volume, that the pace of conversation was not going to slow down to match yours, that the rooms you kept entering were designed for a different kind of energy than the kind you carry. And somewhere in that accumulation, you stopped pushing, not out of bitterness, not out of defeat, out of something quieter and more honest than either. The recognition that the effort of performing presence in spaces that do not nourish you was costing more than the loneliness of staying home. This is why quiet people become quieter with age, not because something is fading, because something is clarifying. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what quiet actually is in neurological terms. Because quiet is not the absence of something. It is not a deficit of social energy or a failure of communication. It is a mode of processing, and it is one that intensifies with age rather than diminishes. Research in personality neuroscience has consistently shown that people who tend toward introversion process stimulation through longer and more complex neural pathways than those who tend toward extroversion. Their brains route information through areas associated with internal thought, long-term memory, and planning. This means that the same social interaction that energizes one person requires significantly more cognitive work in another, not because the quiet person is less capable, because their system is doing more with the same input, processing it more deeply, connecting it to more internal reference points, extracting more meaning from fewer words. When you are young, this deeper processing coexists with a nervous system that still has surplus energy. The social demands of school, early career, and young adulthood can be met even when they are costly because the system has reserves. It can afford the expense. The performance is sustainable even when it is draining because the body recovers quickly and the social consequences of opting out feel too high to risk. But as the body ages, the reserves shift, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but gradually the cost-benefit calculation changes. The energy available for social performance decreases. The tolerance for stimulation that does not serve you narrows, and the consequences of opting out, which once felt catastrophic, begin to feel manageable, even preferable. The nervous system is not shutting down. It is becoming more efficient, more selective, more honest about what it can afford and what it is willing to spend. This is the first reason quiet people become quieter. The biological cost of social performance increases while the perceived reward decreases. And the system, doing what any intelligent system does, begins to conserve. And the conservation is not just about energy. It is about integrity. The nervous system of a quiet person has spent decades in a state of mild but persistent self-override, saying yes when the body said no, staying when the body said leave, engaging when the body said rest. Each of those overrides was survivable in the moment, but across decades they accumulate. The nervous system develops a longer memory for what cost it and a shorter tolerance for being overridden. By 50, by 60, the body is no longer willing to negotiate the way it did at 25. It does not argue. It does not rebel dramatically. It simply stops volunteering for experiences that have historically returned less than they required. And the person, finally aligned with what their body has been trying to tell them for years, follows. But there is another layer beneath the biology, and it has to do with what happens to a quiet person's relationship with themselves over the course of a lifetime. When you are young and quiet, the world tells you constantly that your quietness is a problem. Speak up. Put yourself out there. You need to be more social. You will miss out. These messages arrive from parents, teachers, peers, and the culture at large. And because you are young, because your identity is still forming, because the desire to belong is at its peak, you absorb these messages. You internalize them. You begin to believe that the way you naturally exist in the world is insufficient, that the richness of your inner life does not count unless it is externalized, that the quiet is something to overcome rather than something to inhabit. So you spend years overcoming it. You build strategies. You develop social scripts. You learn how to perform engagement convincingly enough that most people never suspect the effort behind it. And the performance works. You make friends. You hold jobs. You move through the social world with enough fluency that the quiet becomes invisible to everyone except you. But it never stops being there. Beneath the performance, the quiet self remains, waiting, observing, holding everything the performance could not carry. And then something happens in the middle years of life. The performance starts to feel expensive in a way it did not before. Not because you have become less capable, because you have become more honest. Decades of living have shown you, through experience rather than theory, that the social world you spent so much energy adapting to was never going to adapt to you. That the rooms that required your performance were never going to become rooms where your natural way of being was enough. And that the version of yourself you had been presenting, the louder, more available, more responsive version, was never the version that felt most true. This is where the quieting deepens. It is not withdrawal. It is arrival. The quiet person is finally arriving at a relationship with themselves that the earlier years did not allow. A relationship where the inner life is no longer treated as inferior to the outer one. Where silence is not a symptom but a preference. Where the need to justify solitude to others begins to dissolve because the person has finally stopped believing they owe the world an explanation for how they are built. And this arrival often coincides with a release that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not lived it. The release of caring about how the quietness is perceived. For decades, the quiet person has carried a secondary burden alongside their natural temperament. The burden of managing how others interpret it, making sure the silence does not seem rude, making sure the solitude does not seem depressive, making sure the preference for depth over breadth does not seem elitist. This management, invisible and constant, was in some ways more exhausting than the social performance itself, because it never stopped. Even in private, the quiet person was rehearsing how to explain themselves. And when that management finally lifts, when the person decides they are no longer willing to narrate their temperament to a world that was never going to fully understand it, the relief is enormous. Not because the world's opinion no longer exists, but because the energy previously spent managing that opinion has finally been returned to the person who needed it most. As quiet people age, something else happens that accelerates the quieting. Their tolerance for inauthenticity drops. In the earlier decades, it was possible to maintain friendships and social connections that were not deeply nourishing. The energy was there. The social cost of not participating was high. The discomfort of shallow interaction was tolerable because it was offset by the comfort of belonging, even if that belonging was partial. But with age, the calculus shifts. The quiet person has now accumulated enough experience to know the difference between connection that feeds them and connection that depletes them. They know what a real conversation feels like. They know the difference between being heard and being waited out. They know the specific quality of a friendship where silence is comfortable versus one where silence is suspicious. And they are no longer willing to spend their increasingly finite energy pretending there is no difference. This is not cynicism. It is discernment refined by decades of observation. The quiet person has been watching the social world their entire life, not from the sidelines in a passive sense, from a vantage point that most people never occupy because they are too busy participating to notice what they are participating in. And from that vantage point, the quiet person has gathered an enormous amount of data about human behavior. Who is genuine? Who is performing? Which conversations produce depth and which ones only produce noise? Which relationships survive silence and which ones depend entirely on activity to feel alive? By midlife, this data has become a filter that operates almost automatically. New social opportunities are evaluated not by their potential for excitement, but by their potential for depth. Invitations are accepted not based on obligation, but on the honest question of whether this interaction will leave me more full or more empty. And the answer, more often than not, is that fewer interactions of higher quality produce more satisfaction than many interactions of low substance. This is why the social world of a quiet person contracts as they age, not because they have fewer options, but because they have become unwilling to invest in the options that do not return something real. And this contraction, paradoxically, often produces deeper satisfaction than the wider social life of their younger years ever did, because the relationships that survive the filter are the ones that were real all along. The friend who never needed you to be louder. The partner who learned to read your silence as its own form of communication. The handful of people who understood that your quietness was not a wall but a doorway, and who walked through it patiently enough to find what was on the other side. These connections do not diminish with the quieting. They deepen. Because the energy that was previously distributed across dozens of obligations is now concentrated on the few bonds that actually sustain the person. And those bonds, receiving the full weight of the quiet person's attention, become richer than anything a crowded calendar could have produced. There is a dimension of this quieting that has to do with something the world rarely discusses: the relationship between quiet and mortality. As a person ages, the awareness of limited time becomes less abstract and more physical. It is not a thought that arrives occasionally and then recedes. It becomes a background awareness, a persistent understanding that the years remaining are fewer than the years spent. And this awareness does not produce panic in quiet people, the way it might in others. It produces concentration. When you know that time is finite, every hour spent in a room that drains you becomes a more significant loss. Every conversation that demands performance instead of allowing presence becomes more obviously costly. Every relationship maintained out of guilt rather than genuine connection becomes harder to justify. The awareness of death does not make quiet people morbid. It makes them precise. It sharpens the filter. It narrows the aperture of what they are willing to tolerate in their remaining time. And what passes through that narrowed aperture is almost always the same thing: depth, stillness, honesty, the presence of people who do not require them to be anything other than what they are. This is why the oldest quiet people often seem the most at peace. They have reached a point where the social performance has been fully released. The need to explain themselves has expired. The concern about how their quietness is perceived has faded to the point of irrelevance. What remains is a person who has spent a lifetime building a relationship with their own inner world and has finally been given the time and the permission to live inside it fully, not because they have given up on the outer world, because they have finally stopped pretending it was ever their primary residence. And there is something in this peace that others sense even when they cannot name it. A groundedness, a lack of urgency that is not apathy but clarity, a stillness that does not feel empty but occupied. People in the presence of an older, quiet person often describe the experience the same way without knowing why. It feels calm near them, not because the quiet person is doing anything, but because they have stopped doing the thing that most people never stop doing. They have stopped performing. And in the absence of performance, something authentic becomes available. Not for consumption, for proximity. Simply being near someone who is fully at rest inside themselves produces a quality of presence that no amount of conversation can replicate. There is something that quiet people discover in the later years that the noisy world will never fully understand. That silence is not empty. It is full of things that noise covers up. In silence, the mind does not stop working. It works differently. It returns to thoughts that were interrupted. It revisits memories that conversation would have displaced. It connects ideas that the speed of social interaction would have kept apart. It processes emotion that the demands of the day did not leave room for. And it rests, not in the way that sleep provides rest, in the way that only stillness provides. The kind of rest where the self is not being pulled in any direction, where nothing is required, where the only audience is the person themselves, and where the quality of that inner company has become, after decades of practice, more sustaining than any room full of people could provide. This is the secret that quiet people carry into old age, that the silence they have been building a relationship with their entire life does not become emptier as they age. It becomes richer. The inner world does not shrink. It deepens. The thoughts become more layered. The memories become more textured. The capacity to sit with a feeling without needing to name it or express it or resolve it becomes stronger with every year of practice. And the peace that arrives, when it arrives, is not the peace of resignation. It is the peace of a mind that has finally been given the space to operate exactly as it was designed to, without performance, without apology, without the constant background effort of translating itself into a language that was never its own. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the aging quiet person. They are not becoming less. They are becoming more of what they always were. The quietness that the world spent decades trying to correct was never a flaw to be managed. It was a capacity to be developed. And the person who has spent a lifetime developing it has arrived at something that the louder world rarely achieves. A self that does not need the room to confirm its existence. A presence that does not depend on being noticed. A fullness that was built entirely from the inside and that no external circumstance can take away. This is not a story about people disappearing. It is a story about people arriving at themselves, arriving at a way of being that was always there, but that the younger years, with all their noise and pressure and demand, never had room to fully allow. If you are this person, The quiet that is deepening inside you is not a loss. It is a harvest, the accumulation of decades of internal work that the outside world never saw and never will. The richness of a mind that has learned to stay with itself through every season of life without needing to announce what it found there. You are not fading. You are distilling. And what remains after the distillation is not less. It is the purest version of everything you have always been. Concentrated, unhurried, finally unapologetically whole. And if you love someone like this, someone who is growing quieter with time, do not mistake their silence for absence. Do not try to pull them back into a volume they have outgrown. The greatest act of love you can offer is to sit beside them in the quiet and trust that what lives in that space between you is not nothing. It is everything they have spent a lifetime learning to hold, and it is being shared with you simply by being near. If this describes something you have felt but never heard named, you are not alone in it. This channel is a space for the quieter patterns of the human mind, the ones that shape everything but rarely get spoken. If this meant something to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. And if you are willing, leave something in the comments. Not a paragraph, not an explanation, just a word. Because sometimes the quietest response says the most. Thank you for watching.